I believe I have discovered where Jesus was when he ascended into heaven. This is going to be a fascinating study. In this video, we're going to look at the topography of the Mount of Olives, where according to tradition, Jesus ascended into heaven in the sight of his disciples after his resurrection. The traditional belief is that he ascended from the top of the Mount of Olives. But if we examine the evidence, we discover that it was actually from a specific and exact location on the southeastern slope of the Mount of Olives. So let's get started with our journey back in time to uncover the truth. We begin our study with the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 50. And it came to pass, while he blessed them, he was parted from them and carried up into heaven. Now, there are several interesting details in this verse that deserve our attention. The first detail is the word carried. This word in the Greek text is pheru, which means to carry or convey by a vehicle. It implies a movement that is not under the control of the one being moved. In other words, Jesus was not walking or running up a hill. He was carried or conveyed in some sort of vehicle up into heaven. This detail alone suggests that the ascension took place from an elevated position, perhaps from the top of a mountain or a hill. Because why would you need a vehicle to convey someone if you were just walking or running? Now let's consider the second interesting detail in this verse, the word ascended. The Greek word for ascended is anabaino, which means to go up or climb. It can also mean to ascend or to mount. However, in the context of the ascension, it carries the specific meaning of mounting or ascending by a vehicle such as an airplane or a spaceship. This detail further supports the idea that Jesus did not walk or run up a hill, but rather he used some sort of vehicle to ascend into heaven. So what kind of vehicle did Jesus use to ascend into heaven? Well, the answer is found in another detail in the same verse, the word, he was parted from them. This phrase in the Greek text is ektesan autus, which means to separate or divide. It can also mean to distribute or apportion. However, in the context of the ascension, it carries the specific meaning of separating or dividing by a distance or space. In other words, Jesus was carried away from his disciples by a certain distance or space, which implies that he did not simply vanish into thin air, but rather he went somewhere. So where did he go? Well, the answer is found in the previous verse, Luke 24:49, where it says, "And behold, I am sending the promise of my Father upon you, but stay in the city until you are clothed with power from on high." The disciples were told to stay in Jerusalem until they received the Holy Spirit, which they did in the upper room where the first Pentecost took place. Therefore, it is reasonable to conclude that Jesus ascended into heaven from a location that was visible to the disciples in Jerusalem, which brings us to the topography of the Mount of Olives. According to tradition, Jesus ascended from the top of the Mount of Olives, which is about 1,500 feet or 500 meters above sea level. But if we examine the text, we discover that the disciples saw Jesus ascending from the southeastern slope of the Mount of Olives towards the eastern end of the Kidron Valley, where the Garden of Gethsemane is located. This detail is supported by the fact that the word ascended in the Greek text has the specific meaning of mounting or ascending by a vehicle. Therefore, the most plausible explanation is that Jesus used a kind of vehicle like an airplane or a spaceship to ascend into heaven from the southeastern slope of the Mount of Olives. This would explain why he needed to be carried and why his disciples saw him ascending towards the east, because vehicles usually fly or ascend in that direction. Furthermore, this detail fits perfectly with the topography of the area. The southeastern slope of the Mount of Olives is about 600 feet or 180 meters lower than the top, which would provide enough elevation for a vehicle to gain speed and altitude before disappearing over the horizon towards the east. This would also explain why Jesus instructed his disciples to meet him in Galilee after his resurrection, because they would have been able to see him ascending from a distance and know exactly where to go to meet him. So I believe that the exact location of Jesus' ascension was from the southeastern slope of the Mount of Olives, about halfway down towards the Garden of Gethsemane. From this vantage point, Jesus could have been seen by his disciples who were staying in Jerusalem. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe for more videos. Until next time, Shalom.